For this audience, I don't need to labour the reality of the disadvantages suffered by men and boys. They are many, most are serious in nature, and most are severe in extent. In my book and blog, I attribute this to the gender empathy gap. Not a concept by any means novel to me, the empathy gap is a muted empathy towards males by society as a whole. In general, men and women both have far reduced empathy for men than for women placed in otherwise identical situations. I'm going to take this as a given. What I set out to do today is to clarify where this gender empathy gap originates and what we might do to ameliorate some of its worst effects. The first of those objectives is a great deal easier than the second. So, the origin of the empathy gap. Does the empathy gap originate in biology? Or is it evolution? Or is it a natural aspect of gendered psychology? Or is it rooted in some moral precept? Or is it a product of feminism? Or is it leftist politics generally that is to blame? Or is it more a sociological phenomenon related to economics and technological progress? The answer is yes, it is all of those things. Let's see how they fit together. Starting with biology and evolution, we shall see how these morph into psychology and morality and feminism. Many people have asked how deep the rabbit hole goes. In the case of the empathy gap, there's an answer. The rabbit hole is 300 million years deep. It goes back to the dawn of anisogamous or dimorphic sexual reproduction. The empathy gap arises out of male disposability. The empathy gap is a psychological disposition in both sexes, which facilitates male disposability by rendering it invisible. The idea of male disposability originated within the men's movement, but it's little appreciated that male disposability is not confined to Homo sapiens, but is a biological phenomenon common to maleness itself across all species where maleness exists. Indeed, the very purpose of males is to be disposable. The use of the word disposable in the evolutionary context is a shorthand for the following: that evolutionary pressure, that is selection pressure, acts more strongly on males than females, and that males will tend to be more exposed than females to danger which may result in injury or death. Remarkably, the origin and persistence of dimorphic sexual reproduction, which means the origin and purpose of distinct males and females, remains scientifically unsettled, so I must not appear too definitive. The problem is this: compared to asexual reproduction or hermaphroditic reproduction, the dimorphic or anisogamous variety carries a twofold cost. That is, in dimorphic sexual species, it takes a pair of individuals of different sex to create one offspring. In contrast, in asexual or hermaphrodite species, every individual can produce an offspring. So, given that evolution cares only for reproductive success, why is sexual reproduction the dominant mechanism on Earth and virtually universal among the higher species? There must be some powerful evolutionary advantage to dimorphic reproduction to offset this apparent inefficiency: the twofold reduction in birth rate. Naively, one might guess that the answer lies in the enhanced genetic variety arising through anisogamous sexual reproduction. But this does not stand up to scrutiny. For one thing, hermaphroditic sexual reproduction also involves recombination of genes, and hence has the potential to promote variety without the twofold cost of dimorphism. The lead theory now is that the success of specifically dimorphic sexual reproduction lies in three things. Firstly, that sexual reproduction filters out deleterious mutations. Secondly, that the burden of this mutational cleansing falls disproportionately upon males. And thirdly, that sexual dimorphism permits mate selection of males by females. The combination of these three features comprises the male genetic filter mechanism, and that is biology speak for male disposability. In other words, the evolutionary purpose of males is to be disposable. This male genetic filter mechanism is the ground zero of male disposability. All specific later cultural manifestations of male disposability can be regarded as indirect consequences of it. But what about the male disadvantages, which are not overtly biological, but rather socially or culturally instantiated? These too are manifestations of male disposability. The importance of dimorphism lies in mate selection of males by females. Genetic quality in males is made apparent in multiple ways, including various surrogates such as anatomical or behavioral displays, as well as the male hierarchies. Those men who are filtered out by this mechanism are evolutionary dross, and nature wastes no compassion upon them. Males are obliged to play a high-risk game. To decline to play is to lose. You will then leave no mark on the future. You may be skeptical on the grounds that our rational, conscious minds might be expected to veto such primitive tendencies, that our sense of fairness or perhaps the social power of males would neutralize the genetically encouraged disposability of males. But such doubts simply underestimate the strength of our innate proclivities. It's often the case that humans' cognitive capacity provides an obstacle to evolution's imposition of genetically preferred behavioral characteristics. We humans need to believe that we are in charge of ourselves, that we are acting for rational reasons which we understand, and are not merely being driven like automatons as helpless slaves of our genes. Emotions frequently provide the vehicle for providing us with proximate rationalizations of our behaviors, whose true distal origin is genetic. The human pair bond, so central to our evolutionary success as a species, is a case in point. Large swathes of our culture being spin-offs from the associated emotional complexes. I refer, of course, to love, not a word you will often hear in gender political discussion, which is telling. The feminist insistence that the human pair bond is essentially men's wish to dominate and oppress women has blinded us to the obvious, that men's role in the pair bond is actually altruistic. The direct roles of the male and the female in reproduction are profoundly unequal. The woman's physical investment is huge and dangerous. The man's direct contribution, negligible. But evolution has found a way to make good use of what might otherwise have been underemployed males. Thanks to bipedalism and our outsized brains, human babies are born functionally premature and helpless, making enormous demands upon adult care. In primitive societies, fathers who stick around to help enhance the survival prospects of their offspring make a huge difference to those survival prospects. This is the pair bond in which men provide protection and resources to the mother and child. There is an evolved, innate inclination in men to do this, which is mediated by the aforementioned emotional complexes. But it's also culturally enhanced. The inclination in men to protect and provide is matched naturally by an expectation in women to receive such attentions. Part of this inclination can be regarded as moral in content. Sentiments of female vulnerability and need of protection, in contrast with male strength and assumed lack of neediness, provides a moral driver for the provision of protection and resources from man to woman. In distal reality, evolution has worked these innate psychological biases as a means of ensuring that resources flow to the child, thus maximizing its likelihood of survival. The roles of the two sexes in the pair bond are grossly asymmetric. The pair bond involves women's needs controlling men's efforts. This is not because evolution has any preference for women, but because the mother is a proxy for the children, and evolution has a very great interest in children's survival. Consequently, what women say is good becomes men's definition of good, a ceding of moral authority to women. This is the most important feature of gender relations, but it goes unnoticed by feminists because they place oppressive patriarchy in its stead. But the flip side of this natural matricentric process is that men's needs are ignored. Thus, the intrinsic male disposability of the male genetic filter is amplified by this additional evolved mechanism. I stress that this evolved matricentrism should not be seen as pejorative, precisely because it is biologically evolved. Nevertheless, the asymmetry of the pair bond means that whilst the woman, as the prospective mother, has an innate entitlement to male care and provisioning, the man in question has no such entitlement, and they both share this view. That then is the biological origin of the empathy gap. Now, this is all very well, I hear you ask, but all these things go back tens of thousands of years. How come the situation of men and boys has degraded so badly over the last 60 years or so? Well, that's where cultural enhancement of natural and beneficial matricentrism leads to outright gynocentrism, which is far from socially beneficial. Had feminism been an egalitarian movement, it would have recognized the reality of the male disadvantages, readily apparent in empirical data, and also recognized the empathy gap, which has always facilitated the male disadvantages by rendering them invisible. But it was never an egalitarian movement. Feminism is a lobby for women. That in itself is not reprehensible. Lobby groups always lobby for their particular constituents. But feminism has passed itself off as motivated by equality, which was always a subterfuge. Feminism has relentlessly levered advantage from the empathy gap. It is not a progressive movement. It is deeply atavistic, basing its influence squarely on traditional gender scripts of female vulnerability and the irrelevance of male needs. The feminist movement has promoted women's interests, or more accurately, what seems to them to be women's interests, by continually reinforcing the claim that inequality is always to women's disadvantage. Because men and boys have been deliberately and explicitly represented as privileged, then clearly they deserve nothing. This is both facilitated by and reinforces the empathy gap and drives worsening male disadvantages, which are either invisible or simply don't matter. But still, I've not answered why this has occurred specifically over the last 60 years or so. Why not earlier? The answer is mostly technology and economic circumstances related to technology, plus the politics of the welfare state, which also relates back to said economics and hence to technology. Advances in technology in the 60s precipitated enormous social changes, which contributed to the rise of feminism and the increasing disadvantage to men and boys. There are three ways this happened. Firstly, there was the contraceptive pill. I need hardly explain the significance of that. Secondly, the widespread deployment of labor-saving devices in the home meant that keeping house was no longer a full-time occupation. Housewives became bored and moved into the world of work. And thirdly, that move by women into the world of work, paid work that is, was facilitated by technology, which created a far greater proportion of office jobs or other jobs which did not involve hard labor, together with the expansion of the public sector and the caring and social industries, which provided plentiful employment for women. There was no invasion of male occupations by women historically, when 95% of such work was grueling hard labor, outdoors in all weathers, and frequently leading to an early death. It's staggering to recall that in the UK alone, and in one industry alone, namely coal mining, an average of over 1,000 men per year were killed every year. And this lasted for well over a century until it ended in about the 1950s. That's the reality of male privilege, not privilege, but disposability, made acceptable by the empathy gap. So it was largely technology and the associated economic improvements that precipitated feminism and the attack on all things male when it did. However, politics now enters the picture because there was a clearly Marxist element in the early feminist movement. Moreover, the objectives of feminism explicitly involve the disadvantaging of men, namely to make women independent of men, including in the domestic context. Thus, the ejection of men from the home and the destruction of the nuclear family are inherent and explicit in feminism. Undermining fatherhood is not accidental. And whilst one might argue that this could have stopped short of the demonization of masculinity, in practice, the vilification of males has been a useful tool to present men as undeserving and hence to widen the empathy gap and so to ensure the ever-increasing male disadvantages remain unacknowledged. Denigration was ever the handmaiden of discrimination. In 60 years, the only change has been that it's got worse as feminists have gained more and more civic and legislative power. The mantras of male privilege and male toxicity are increasingly desperate attempts to keep male disposability from being apprehended because society has a visceral need to maintain male disposability, which requires that it remains covert. The empathy gap is the enabler. That is why people of the opposite opinion will react with such venom to these observations being voiced. It is essential to the maintenance of their worldview that the gender empathy gap remains unacknowledged. So that's where the empathy gap, male disposability, and the male disadvantages come from. Originating in evolution, these linked phenomena have been amplified by successive cultural forces. Now to the far harder question: what can we do about it? To make a bleak picture seem bleaker still, it's no longer possible to view gender issues in isolation from broader socio-political issues. The primary tumour has long since metastasized. Gender issues are now embedded into the cultural hegemony of intersectional woke, and to tackle that with any degree of thoroughness would take us to the woke industrial complex and the phenomenon of moral usurpation and a whole different talk. I won't go there today. I'll just say this in passing. Don't be misled by the undoubted origins of wokeism in neo-Hegelian cultural Marxism. It is best seen as the latest stratagem by the elites to bolster their control. However, what's to be done? Let me say straight away that I'm not much of an activist, but I'll make a few observations. I'll concentrate on one issue, the issue of fathers and children. I see that Paul Nathanson is speaking after me. In their epic series, Nathanson and Young opine that in order for any group to have a healthy identity, they must have a group function which is both necessary and distinctive, which only they can fulfill, and hence be a group worthy of being publicly valued. For men, they conclude, fatherhood is the answer to an ongoing positive identity. The trouble is that fatherhood, unlike motherhood, is a social phenomenon. If the culture does not protect fatherhood, then it will wither away. Not only has the culture failed to protect fatherhood, it has been under continual attack, and so it is failing. Fatherhood has become a temporary status conferred upon a man on sufferance by the mother and can be revoked at any time, subject to the mother's will. Exactly how the cultural protection of fatherhood can be reinstated socially and legally, I don't know, but that is the challenge to be addressed. What I can contribute to the discussion is this: the power that must be invoked to address this challenge is the power of women. This is why I have stressed where the moral power lies in gender relations and how deep it goes. It will not do to rely upon the power of men to implement policies beneficial to men because, and I will assert this in the teeth of universal incredulity, we don't have any. If we did, this conference would not be necessary. How the power of women can be invoked in this matter, I now outline. Essentially, it is the usual power of the powerless, whose value lies in their labor, the power of strike. The social, legal, and political changes over the last 60 years have destroyed the ability of Western societies to physically replace themselves. It must be brought home to the public that marriage, cohabitation, and family are now far too unattractive to young men, if not downright hazardous. I don't believe in telling people what to do, and I expect you do not either, but I do believe that people should be informed before making decisions about potentially hazardous undertakings. Young people, and young men in particular, still blunder into cohabitation and babies without appreciating the statistics regarding what is likely down the road for them. So tell them. Create organizations dedicated to conveying accurate statistics on marriage, cohabitation, and living arrangements to young people of both sexes. Tell them what percentage of marriages end in divorce, what percentage of fathers live with their biological children full-time during their whole childhood, and what percentage of cohabiting couples split before children reach, say, the age of 5 years or 10 or 15. Give them the data on non-resident parents' contact with their own children and what percentage of these are fathers. Give them the data on maintenance payments and imprisonment for non-payment, if this applies in your country. It doesn't in the UK, incidentally. Give them the data on male suicide and its relationship with parental separation, child contact denial, parental alienation, and false allegations. Give them a reference list of academic studies on the effects of fatherlessness on children. Acquaint them with the soaring incidence of mental disorders, especially in young adults. See if they can put one and one together there. Invite them to consider why previously robust and resilient young Western people have been turned into melting snowflakes. If the changes of the last half century have been so great, why do they feel so crap? Increasingly, children are no longer their parents, but the state's. There is currently a lot of unrest among parents in the US, I note, and in the UK too, incidentally, regarding what state-funded schools are putting into children's heads. Well, what they're intent on putting there is the ideology that the system needs to perpetuate itself, the system with the consequences just outlined. A big win would be to recapture the schools. Meanwhile, couples considering children might want to agree in advance that homeschooling is the way to go. State schooling is, frankly, looking increasingly like child abuse. The monstrous reality of these issues needs exposing to the public in general and young people in particular. Do we even have a society in which it is responsible to introduce children anymore? The reality of their position needs to be communicated effectively to young men. The evolutionary conditions that gave rise to the empathy gap no longer apply. Historically, women were vulnerable in intimate relations because the risk of unwanted pregnancy outside marriage at a time when this carried crushing stigma was very real. This has changed. Women now have multiple ways to protect themselves against unwanted pregnancy. It's now young men who are vulnerable in intimate relations, but they are often unaware of this, being fooled by the narrative about male power and privilege until they learn the hard way. So warn them. For 50 years, fathers have been discovering only too late that our culture regards them as unnecessary at best, if not actually harmful to their own children. Gigabytes of academic studies to the contrary have not withstood the cold and deliberate implementation of policies to alienate children from their fathers. Young men need to understand the reality of their position, just as historically young women used to be instructed to be very defensive and cautious in their relations with men for reasons of their vulnerability. Now the boot is on the other foot. Young men need to appreciate their vulnerability in intimate relations. I'll mention in passing in regard to coercive sex that we know now that both sexes are subject to it and at rates which are not so very different. But de facto, only one sex is protected, whatever the law says in principle. However, it's the fatherhood issue which is the more important. I do not advocate the MGTOW wholesale rejection of women. Such an extreme response, whilst understandable in those who have been badly treated in the past, is not constructive. It's ultimately nihilistic and hardly fulfills the requirement to be positive rather than negative. However, young men contemplating an intimate relationship must be brought to understand that it is they who are vulnerable in particular in respect of the status of fatherhood being in their partner's hands. I suggest this, that young men contemplating cooperating with pregnancy are encouraged to ask their partner outright how they can guarantee their equal parenting as fathers, whatever might transpire in future. Young women need to be brought hard up against the fact that they have no answer to that, other than a personal reassurance which statistics undeniably demonstrate turns out to be untrue in a very large proportion of cases. The only card men have to play is this one: withdrawal of cooperation with conception and family provisioning under prevailing conditions. I stress, under prevailing conditions. I repeat, it's up to individuals what they choose to do with their lives, and I'm not suggesting some sort of organized marriage strike. That would never take off. But the reality that faces fathers needs to be communicated to young men and women before they find out the hard way. Society has failed to protect fatherhood, and this is a catastrophe which can be corrected only by reintroducing such protection. Women need to be brought to understand that the era of their political power being used only for feminist objectives is over. Women must now accept the responsibility inherent in having political power. Women's political responsibility is now to end and reverse the trashing of fatherhood, because only they can do it. Either that or Western civilization is over. If that sounds like wild hyperbole, it isn't. It isn't even a prediction. It's just an observation. The indigenous peoples of all Anglophone and Western European countries are failing to reproduce themselves, and there's reason to believe that average fertilities will decrease even further. The reinstitution of cultural protection of fatherhood will never happen merely because men campaign for it. The reason is that in such matters, women's moral authority is unchallengeable. That is why I emphasized that the evolved human pair bond is based upon ceding moral authority to women, an authority which women still possess. Therefore, unless women reinstitute cultural protection of fatherhood and legislate accordingly, Western peoples are facing decline and possible extinction. In the meantime, and to avoid ending on such an apocalyptic note, from the perspective of the individual man, things are not so bleak. Your highest duty is, as ever, to your personal integrity and the pursuit of the genuine personal virtues. If you have one, embrace your religion more tightly than ever. But be that as it may, we still have access to the richest cultural heritage the world has ever known. So let that be your refuge. Thank you.